Validators are next. What do these requirements have in common? When a support ticket is reopened, the reason has to be stated in a comment. When closing a payment request, the payment data is mandatory. When the developer fixes a bug, a fix version has to be entered. Let's take a look at the answer. All of these requirements define input that must be made during the workflow transition. A validator checks that any input made during the transition is valid before the transition is performed. Input can be gathered from the user on a transition screen. If a validator fails, workflow errors are presented to the user. The issue does not progress to the next status, and the post functions are not executed. The most common use case involves making fields or comments required on specific transitions as the issue progresses through its life cycle. Making the field required through field configuration makes it required from the beginning, but some values are not known until a later time. So that is why fields required validators are useful later in the workflow process. In this example, the developer must enter the time spent on the issue when submitting an issue for code review. Here are some examples of validators. Fields required. This is used to gather more information throughout the lifecycle of an issue, as we have seen. For example, you must input the root cause analysis field with detailed information before resolving an outage ticket. Or you must enter comments when rejecting an approval request. Regular expression check. This is useful when you need to validate that information has been entered in a certain format. You might use this when validating that an email address contains an @ symbol. Date compare. This is useful when you need to validate that an issue was created within a certain date window. You might use it to validate that an issue's creation date is before the due date. Or you might require start date and end date when moving to schedule status, and at the same time validate that start date is before the end date. Transition screens are used to capture information as an issue moves through a transition. When a user clicks the transition screen allows the user to enter the needed information. For example, when a manager rejects a request for a new mobile device, he may enter the reason for the rejection in a comment. These are not the only screens in Jira. Users interact with data when they create, edit, and view issues as well. These three issue operations, create, edit, view, are mapped to screens via a screen scheme and to an issue type via issue type screen scheme. But in this presentation, we focus only on transition screens. Jira supplies some transition screens built into the default workflows. For example, the Resolve Issue screen, which is shared by all new software projects and is used for all issue types in the workflow. Only Jira administrators can create custom transition screens and associate them with workflow transitions. Here are two examples of custom transition screens. The one on the left only has the comment field and no other fields. Comment field is added automatically to every transition screen if a user has comment permissions. If the user does not have comment permissions, the field will not be shown to that user. The screen on the right is a custom transition screen called Pay and Close, showing various other fields. Note that you can actually use any screen as a transition screen. You could, for example, use the Create screen from a project as a transition screen. But as a best practice, you want to include only the fields that should be entered or modified during that transition. Otherwise, a transition screen becomes too cluttered and is frustrating to users. Now let's go back to our house building workflow for a moment and those self-reflecting transitions, like the re-estimate, which is shown here. One other common use case for these self-reflecting transitions is to restrict editing of some fields to some users. For example, let's say that the requirement is that only the homeowner should be allowed to edit the budget field after the house building request is created. Everyone else should just view it. But everyone else should be able to edit the other fields. Jira does not have field-level permissions, so how can we achieve this requirement? Remember that transition screens can contain fields that don't appear on the other screens. We can put fields for which we want to restrict editing only on a transition screen, but not on the edit issue screen. And then we can use a condition so that the transition, and hence the transition screen, is only available to some users. Since we don't really want the issue to change statuses, we can utilize the self-reflecting transition. Here is how to meet that requirement in more detail. The budget field is placed on the Create Issue and View Issue screens, but not on the Edit Issue screen. The budget field is also placed on a transition screen. A self-reflecting transition called Modify Budget is created on the New Plan status, and it loops back to the same status. The transition has a condition that only the homeowner, that means the reporter, can execute this transition. The result is that only the homeowner can see the transition and thus modify the budget field, which is on the transition screen. Everyone else can just view the budget field. The only purpose of the self-reflecting transition is to restrict the ability to edit the budget field after issue creation from everyone but the reporter. There is a similar use case for validators and transition screens. The resolution field is a special system field. Whenever it appears on a screen, it is required. So you would not want to place it on the Create screen. Instead, it appears on the Resolve Issue screen only at those transition points in the workflow where you are ready to go to a done status. And at that point, it is required. But you can put other fields on a transition screen and require them with a validator. Transition screens plus validators provide a way to make fields mandatory at any point in your workflow, rather than at the time of issue creation. This also provides the flexibility to clear field values on a certain transition and then make them mandatory again later in the workflow. To make a field mandatory during a workflow transition, you use a validator and a transition screen together. So let's put this all together and look at an example of how a transition with configured validators appears in Jira. There are 4 validators configured in this example and a transition screen. When the user clicks on this transition, he will first be presented with this screen in order to update field values and possibly add comments. When he clicks Review, the validators will be evaluated in top-down order. As soon as one of them fails, Jira will stop further validation and return a message to the user. The first validator checks that there is a review due date. Second, that the review due date is within 7 days of the final due date. Third, Jira validates that only one release was selected from a field which is presumably a multi-value field, for example, a version picker field. Finally, the transition validates that the assignee was modified. For example, that the user changed from the person who worked on the issue to the person who will now review the issue. Notice that the comment field is added automatically to the transition screen, but it is not required.